Welcome to the Arab American Institute's first in a series of webinars launching in anticipation, preparation, excitement for the 2030 decennial census. Yalla count MENA in is ready to go, and we are excited to be launching this webinar series with this first of many to come, but particularly related to the wonderful news and exciting development that we had with the Census Bureau's release of the detailed DHC data, which for the first time ever means that Arab Americans have information about our community from a decennial census. So I wanted to turn it over to our experts real quick, but before doing that, I just wanted to share with you all. This is the question that was on the 2020 decennial census. This is how many of our communities encouraged our folks in our Get Out the Count campaigns to check some other race and put in how they identified, or to write in, if they identified with existing races, their national origin or ethnicity. And for the first time ever, because of the way the Census Bureau worked very hard to tabulate and report on this data, we actually have this information available on our community, as I mentioned. I do want to note that this is how we have approached the definition of MENA. It includes the 22 members of the Arab League, the Arab countries. It includes non-Arab MENA countries that are geographically in the region, Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And it also importantly includes transnational communities. Among those listed, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Armenians, Kurds, and Amazigh. It's important to note this because given how we count this, the Census Bureau's release last week got us to a definition of, got us to the number of roughly 3.6 million people from the MENA region. And based on the way that they define Arab nationalities, and again, this is based on the 1997 standards that currently exist in place, the number is roughly at 2.5. If we take the data and we apply the more inclusive definition of MENA, we arrive at a count of Arab Americans that's roughly 2.8 or 3.1, depending on whether or not you take the other MENA aggregate category and include it in those numbers. And the total MENA then population is increased significantly by at least 1 million, depending on how one does that. So I wanted to share that with folks just so that, stop share, there we go, just so that we have an understanding of one, how monumental last week's data release really is in terms of what we were able to do with it. And two, to really have the conversation in the context of adopting an inclusive MENA category and how important that is to getting to an accurate count, which is what drives all of our work. I want to start with Terri Ann Lowenthal. And Terri Ann, before I turn it over to you to kind of explain to us what the DDHC is, what it means, let me introduce you as a nationally recognized or the nationally recognized expert and consultant on all things census. Terri Ann previously served as the staff director of the House Census Oversight Subcommittee, where we trust her encyclopedic knowledge of this topic began to grow and cultivate. Terri Ann, why don't I turn it over to you to start us off with our gathering.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this really important webinar. You know, folks, you only get encyclopedic memory if you're old, and that was Maya's nice way of saying that. Just kidding. Also, I apologize for my raspy voice ahead of time. I'm just getting over a respiratory infection. But Maya's asked me to set the stage for the vital, really vital information that Gigi and Meeta will discuss. So let's get started. First, DHC-A does not roll off the tongue, regrettably, but it stands for the 2020 Census Detailed Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, Installment A, which, yes, means there will be a related but different data set labeled B next year. And today I'll just use DHC for short. So the DHC file contains population counts and sex by age statistics for about 300 detailed race and ethnic groups, such as Lebanese and Jamaican, plus nearly 1,200 American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. Now, the sex by age tabulations cover selected age cohorts, such as age 18 to 24, as an example, depending on the size of the national origin subgroup. The bottom line, the file contains what we call disaggregated data for the major race and ethnicity categories. Now, that means that we have to pause really briefly to review the federal collection of data on race and ethnicity. Maya gave you a quick overview. Let me just fill in a few gaps there. Most people incorrectly assume that the Census Bureau decides what categories to offer as choices on the census. But in fact, it's the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OMB, that sets those categories through a statistical policy known as Directive 15. There are currently 5 major race categories, and Hispanic is the only current ethnicity. Now, as many of you know, OMB has been working to update Directive 15, and those revisions, which we expect next year, could include a new long overdue category for people of Middle Eastern and North African, MENA, which does roll off the tongue, descent. But today, as we eagerly await that, seminal step forward, we're equally excited to highlight the first ever disaggregated data on the MENA population from a decennial census. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. So how did we get to this unprecedented data set that includes MENA national origin data? It all goes back to this OMB policy that we just discussed, because under the current federal race categories, people of MENA descent are white. And in past censuses, if you selected some other race, which was a choice, and wrote in Lebanese, let's say, in the space provided, the Census Bureau would recode your response as white. But lack of a separate MENA category is only part of the reason why, until the 2020 census, the Census Bureau didn't report detailed MENA subgroups. It was the format of the race and ethnicity questions that also made that impossible, because prior to 2020, the race question did not offer space for people who checked the white or Black race categories to write in a subgroup. Fortunately, the 2020 census race question gave everyone that opportunity. Now, not to complicate matters too much, but you also need to know that the Census Bureau reports both the number of people who selected only one response, those are labeled as, air quotes, folks, race alone, and the number of people who selected that category only, plus that category and one or more other categories, those are labeled, air quotes again, race alone or in any combination. So a quick example, someone who checked white and then wrote in one subgroup, Egyptian, would be reported as Egyptian alone. But someone who checked white and wrote in Egyptian and Moroccan, or checked the white and Black race categories and wrote in Egyptian under one or both races, would be reported as Egyptian alone or in any combination. Now, the DHC file offers population counts for groups from the national level down to the census tract level, and everything in between, states, counties, cities, and towns. The Census Bureau, by the way, calls cities and towns places, and American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas. A census tract, my friends, is comparable to an urban or suburban neighborhood or a rural community with an average of 4,000 people and 1,600 housing units. Now, for smaller groups at smaller geographies, the availability of data depends on their population size within a specific geographic area. So subgroups, again, a subgroup being, for example, Lebanese or Iranian, with fewer than 500 people at the national and state levels, and fewer than 1,000 people at sub-state levels will only have population counts. But larger groups will also have data for the selected sex by age cohorts. And that will range from 4 to 23 such cohorts, again, depending on the size for each level of geography. And that's because the Census Bureau must balance the public interest in access to as much detailed data as possible with its legal obligation to protect the confidentiality of all personally identifiable information. So the bottom line, the larger the group at each level of geography, the more data you'll have. And by the way, all of the MENA, air quotes, alone or in combination groups have met the minimum thresholds for data by sex and age. Now, don't fret if you didn't just take notes on that last part. The Census Bureau has a handy-dandy chart showing the population thresholds at different levels of geography for the publication of data. And, you know, I'm sure AAI can include that chart in its follow-up to this webinar. So, Maya, I'm sure that your audience really wants to hear the important information about the MENA population. So that I'll conclude the overview there, and I'll turn it back to you, and happy to participate in Q&A later.
Thank you so much, Terri Ann, for your insights, information, and the incredible work that you continue to do. I want to go next. Well, I should mention, as Terri Ann said, we are making a point of having our comments on a shorter period of time, specifically so that we can allow for questions and answers from folks. So let me turn it over next to Gigi Awad, who is a University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. Dr. Awad's research on Arab Americans and MENA has deeply enriched our work in support of adding a MENA ethnic category. And I'm excited to say that as of April of this year, she is a member of the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee. Let's turn it over to you, Gigi.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. I must say, you know, this is really exciting news, right? We've been starving for any kind of data on this population in the decennial census, and now we have some appetizers, something to whet our appetite, right? And the reason I'm using that particular language is because this is a fantastic start in regards to what we know about those individuals that are willing to write in a response under those racial categories, those broader racial categories. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but we need more. So I do want to say this is great. And I love the fact that this is just the start of gathering accurate data on this community. So in terms of what we know about Arab Americans, you know, I would say that we know a little bit more about Arab Americans, but what we really know is essentially available by how MENA individuals who would be categorized under sort of this broader MENA designation, those individuals, how they were willing to sort of write in, again, a category. And so we really know more about MENA write-in as opposed to Arab American write-ins, if that makes sense. And I just want to make that distinction because it is a distinction. So these data tell us over 3.5 million people identified as MENA alone or in combination with another group, accounting for 1.5% of the white alone or in combination population. So Terri explained the alone or in combination. And we finally get a bit more information about the MENA population in regards to sex and age disaggregated by ethnic group. For example, it's really interesting that Yazidi and Yemeni populations had the largest share of people under 18 years of age, for example. And there is a lot richer data within this particular data set that I have not had a chance to delve into like I would like. But this is the first time that we've had this. And And so I do want to celebrate that. And I do want to mention what is missing from this data set. And so we know that there are some disagreements about who's under this category, or we know that there are some missing populations. For example, Armenians, Turkish folks are missing under this designation. Also, the complicated nature of like Afro-MENA or Afro-Arab populations are also not counted in a way that is easily identifiable within these write-in categories, because it's hard to distinguish between someone who, for example, writes in Egyptian under Black or African American versus someone who writes Egyptian under some other race. So the other question I would have is, I would like to see the data on who wrote in under some other race versus under the white category, because this is something that our community has been fighting for many years, to be disaggregated from the white category, right? So all of these data are gathered within, again, like Terri mentioned, within the 1997 Standards Directive 15 about how we can measure race and ethnicity data and how we can categorize these data. Also, we know that, again, these data are fantastic. It's a great start, but these are write-in data. And I've mentioned that now 3 times, I know. And it's important to mention because write-in data on any survey is notoriously undercounted. So if you are forcing your respondents to write in a category or write in anything on any survey, they usually are less likely to do it compared to whether or not you have a checkbox or you're clicking something online or whatever the case may be. And so the write-in gives us some information, but we're still missing all of those individuals that are not likely to write in anything on any type of survey, let alone the census, the decennial census survey. Furthermore, the polarized nature of Arab MENA identity adds another layer of complexity to how individuals within this population identify. You have individuals that refuse to identify under the white category, period. And so they'll write in some other race, and some individuals won't even write in anything because they are angry that they don't see themselves represented on the form in an actual category, right? So we know that this is really an undercount of the Arab and MENA population, even though we have some information here. So this is a great start. It's exciting to see any representation on a decennial census. And the census is clearly moving in the right direction. However, we do want to fight for that MENA category, because that's the only way we're going to get closer to an accurate count for this population. And it looks like we're on our way with the changes coming out of the Office of Management and Budget. But this is, again, we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Gigi. I really appreciate your remarks. I just want to reiterate the point Gigi was making about the definition of Arab American being as inclusive and as diverse as the Arab American community is, specifically with regards to the inclusion of Afro-Arabs. That is a point here that's not reflected in the data's release because it is reliant upon the 1997 race and ethnicity standards. So as we continue to push and advocate for the new standards, we are noting that that's an important piece of this, including the other communities that were mentioned, and we'll continue to talk about. A reminder to please drop in your questions in the Q&A, because we will get to those. Next, I want to go to Meeta Anand, who is the Senior Director for Census and Data Equity at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Prior to Prior to her that, she served as the New York Immigration Coalition Census 2020 Senior Fellow, where she spearheaded the organization's efforts to ensure a fair and accurate count of New Yorkers, particularly immigrants, in the 2020 decennial census. And we like to call her Meeta, Data Equity Anand. So welcome, Meeta, and let me turn it over to you to talk about the importance of this release and the importance of disaggregate data more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Maya. Can you hear me? Am I good? Excellent. Also glad to know I have a nickname. Didn't know what it was. I would firstly like to congratulate all the advocates that have come before me and that sit alongside me for getting us here today. The very fact that we are able to see these data for the first time is the result of tireless advocacy, and what we hope to see in the future relies on continued advocacy. The data we see with the DDHC-A data, which we celebrated on Thursday with DDHC Data Release Day, which, you know, is resoundingly celebrated. It really, as Gigi said, it all comes from write-in responses. And what we see there, and what I'm going to say might initially sound disconsonant to what Gigi said, but it actually isn't. It speaks to the basic idea of the necessity of self-reporting on the census. Like when people respond for themselves versus being coded by the Bureau versus proxy reporting, that's when we get our most accurate data. So as a foundational principle, we really believe that self-identification is the best way to understand our population. This is not contrary to what Gigi said, because what she's saying is we need a checkbox to allow people to signal where they should be self-identifying and to help them like understand that they are meant to be included. So this is the first step, and it's an exciting first step because it shows and paves the way of where we need to go. So the importance of this data release is incredibly clear. As Maya said, I do a lot of work on disaggregated data. What do I mean by disaggregated data? Data disaggregation refers to the collection, reporting, and analysis of information on specific subgroups by race, ethnicity, and other characteristics. So when we are saying disaggregated data, we are saying here the ability to see MENA subgroups and then the specific subgroups within MENA. And why does this release advance the goal of data disaggregation? So before I get into sort of the more nitty-gritty aspects of it, it is about telling the story of our country. We do not want other people to tell the story of who we are. We want our communities to be able to tell the story themselves, to show the richness of our diversity and our contributions, and to show up in the data, to not be invisibilized. Because if populations don't show up in the data, then their stories are not being told and their needs are not being tended to. With these data, we are then able to do trends, look at trends, do analyses, and this allows for organizing and advocacy, and it allows for people to feel like they are part of a community and to understand that who their community is. These good data, disaggregated data, we need these to advance equity and justice, to address inequalities in our society, and we need complete, accurate, and disaggregated data to give us that full understanding. We see it on a range of issues, whether it be from analyzing immigration trends to analyzing police violence trends to analyzing housing trends, healthcare, especially. We spend a lot of time looking at disaggregated data. And the failure to collect these disaggregated data makes it impossible to tackle inequalities by disguising their existence or scope. So if you were listening to what Maya and Gigi and Terri Ann were saying, MENA has been categorized as white under the OMB standards of 1997. So if these are populations that are experiencing a different lived experience than the classic, for lack of a better word, white population, we are not seeing that when their data is subsumed under the greater category. So these characteristics that we're looking at really allow us, from a civil rights perspective, to look at things like enforcing civil rights law, ensuring equal opportunity, as I stated before, analyzing the impact of policy changes on specific populations and administering programs for specific populations. And understanding, as I said, healthcare outcomes is incredibly important to be able to have these data and to have them on a localized geographic basis. So we're talking a lot about how great this is, and it really, really is. But the question is, great Meeta, great Maya, great Gigi, you keep saying this is great, but not quite there. So how do we get there? How do we get data disaggregation to be mandatory? So I'm going to give you 4 ways. So firstly, everyone has mentioned OMB's race and ethnicity standards of 1997. The OMB earlier this year put out its initial proposal for revised standards, which did include, as one of its proposals, the addition of a MENA category. So that the comment period has ended, but the revised standards have not yet been issued, which means reach out to OMB. They might not need to officially consider what you're saying, but there's no harm in making sure that your voice is heard. Reach out for a listening session. They are still holding them. Reach out to agencies that are part of the federal statistical system and say to them that this is important to you. So the opportunities for advocacy around OMB's revised standards are still there. So one was OMB, 2 agencies around this. Now, secondly, this is not just federal. Yes, the census is a national data set, but all states are collecting race and ethnicity data. So if look at what your state is doing, what we have seen in 2023 is a remarkable sea change in the states that are looking at more disaggregated data, looking at adding a MENA category. We've either seen bills passed or introduced, or groups forming and coalescing around this idea that they want to make sure that we are getting complete and accurate data on our communities. And that goes to my 4th point. We here at the Leadership Conference run a data disaggregation network, what we call DDAN, and we have a newsletter. Sign up for that newsletter, which helps inform people on the importance of data disaggregation and work you can do in your communities or at the federal or national level in trying to ensure that we are getting more meaningful data. For us, data equity means that we are getting accessible, usable data that's informed by communities and in service of communities. And in order to do that, we need community involvement to understand the needs and why it's important to them, because communities can use these data to help advocate for what they need in their lives. So that's where I'll end my remarks for now. And of course, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Meeta. I have never moderated a panel as efficient as you all are in terms of the time here. Thank you. Let's open this up for our question and answer. But before we do so, I have to acknowledge that we are also joined on this webinar by Helen Samhan, who is a co-founder of the Arab American Institute and a current member of the Census National Advisory Committee, and someone whose work has been foundational to getting us to where we are today. So Helen, if you would love to say something at any point here, answer a question, please let us know. But thank you for everything you did to get us to this point. With that, let me go to our first question, who is from Dr. Sophia Arman. The recent MENA data is undercounting by millions of people in the United States. Armenians are a huge group, likely up to 1 million people in the US whose heritage is majority from the region, specifically as Armenian Americans. She's pointing out every major Armenian American organization and a large coalition effort has called on OMB for the end of this exclusion, yet this is again erased here in this recent release. How can MENA be truly representative and inclusive in the future, especially with regards to the Armenian American community? Thank you so much for that question, Sophia. And as we've noted, when we have approached our colleagues at the Bureau and other advocates, we have pointed out that Armenian Americans in the United States in particular, this is the point, MENA made the point about how we self-identify. They do self-identify as a transnational community from the MENA region, and that has certainly been an ongoing part of the conversations with the Bureau. But I turn that to any of my colleagues if they want to offer comment on Sophia's question.
I'm a proponent of the most inclusive MENA category that we can have. And so I absolutely agree that Armenians should be added and included in MENA definitions. I'm writing a book with one of my colleagues, Dr. Rita, and we are talking about this, and we're going to highlight Armenians specifically as a missing population in one of the chapters. So I agree with you. Don't worry, you have allies fighting for the inclusion of Armenians as well. And we're working on it. Remember that identity is a social construct. Race and ethnic identity especially is a social construct. And so it's determined by the realities of what's happening to the people that are in these groups. So this is noted, and we are definitely working on it behind the scenes.
Thank you, Gigi. We have another question touching on Gigi's mention about disaggregating data from the white category. Is there a discussion about adding MENA as an ethnicity under all racial categories? Terri Ann, why don't you explain the structure of the proposed or the initial recommendations of the working group?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, in a nutshell, the proposal from OMB, which would update, if you will, that policy OMB Directive 15 that I discussed, would add MENA as an equal category along with all the other categories in what is also being proposed to be a combined race and ethnicity question, which currently is not allowed under the policy. So there would be, you wouldn't have a need necessarily to write in a MENA subgroup under other races unless that's how you consider yourself. So, you know, it would allow you to check off Black, let's say, and write in, you know, Egyptian or Moroccan or whatever your national origin is. But again, if you just want to identify as MENA, it will, the proposal is to have a combined question that lists all of the races and ethnicities. And Maya, you may want to talk more about the proposal that MENA should be an ethnicity, not a race, in one question and treated equally.
Yeah,
so respect that. You can. Yep.
That is an important point to be made here. We have been advocating for decades for a MENA category, and throughout that process, we've emphasized the point about people from the MENA region being of any race, so that it needs to be an ethnic category like that of Hispanics. So in a combined race and ethnicity question, it would be a MENA category and a Hispanic category that appear as ethnicities, and within that, folks can identify their ethnicity or national origin and then check any race that they may identify with. We feel that that's the most appropriate way to arrive at accurate data collection, which is, again, the objective throughout this whole process. Take another question here from Rashad. Hi, Rashad. Great to have you here. Is it possible to access the data tables via the census other than snapshots from the article? I love this question, Rashad, because it gives me an opportunity to share it and remind folks that the Arab American Institute is a census information center. So we exist in partnership with the Census Bureau to provide demographic data about Arab Americans, and we fulfill those requests for researchers, media outlets, community advocates, and we're here to do that for sure. There is a file that is available on the website that is very large and thus has been a slight barrier in downloading it. But once you do that, Rashad, you absolutely would be able to look at the tables with more details. But I would add again that we are here to provide that service for you as well. So feel free to offer any demographic question that you'd have, and we're happy to get it. Let's take another question from Anthony. Hi, Anthony. I am a Chaldean Lebanese American who serves on the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. I knew the name was familiar. The body that created the Congressional, State House, and State Senate district maps for Michigan. This is an amazing development. I will have large ramifications in the redistricting process. In the 2020 cycle, we did not have MENA data so that we could rely on secondary measures in order to figure out where MENA residents were in Michigan. Primary data in the form of the census is much, much better. We certainly agree. Do you think the current data release is sufficient to be used in the redistricting process and ensure MENA candidates of choice? Let me open that. I have an opinion and I'm happy to share it, but let me ask if any of my colleagues want to weigh in on that as well first. I shall share. No, I don't think that the existing data is sufficient. As all of my colleagues have noted, folks had to proactively write in a response, which is why I started our webinar today with the form that appeared in the 2020 census to give folks a sense of what it took for people to proactively say, this is me. With a checkbox, we believe that a more accurate count will certainly be available. And then I think related to the question you're asking, Anthony, we have a question from Samer Khalif. Great to have you with us, Samer. Your point about, do we have a sense of how large the undercount was? If we use, and I want to be clear on this point, it was incredibly important that the Census Bureau did this, and colleagues there worked for a very long time to make this available to us, the tabulations and the tables this way. So that's a very important development. But if you use what the Census Bureau released, you're looking at 3.5 million from MENA. And as I mentioned, when we took the more inclusive definition, you arrive at 4.7. So that alone is an indication of what is an undercount. And then separate from that, again, a reminder that we're talking about folks having to write in as opposed to checkbox and go from there.
Maya, I know you've got a lot of questions. I ask really quickly to the redistricting question from Anthony. The other thing to keep in mind is that we have data down to the census tract level right now. For much of redistricting, you need data at the census block level, and that's why getting the MENA category through revisions to the official OMB policy will be important, because then for the 2030 census, as well as for the American community, not for AC, I take that back, but you would have data down to the census block level that you can use for all sorts of redistricting efforts.
Thank you, Terri Ann. That's an important addition. Question from Jennifer that I'm going to ask you, Meeta, to answer. How will the data help us reach underserved members of the community? Does it change the context if they choose more than one identity?
So, I will actually flip it a bit. I think part of how it helps us serve is how we choose to use it to help us serve. So if you are able to combine it with other data, you are then able to identify what are the needs that these particular communities have, and then you are then able to use that to conduct outreach or engage with them around these needs. So I often say that when we get these data, it's not just about we have the data for the data's sake. Like, it's what we do with the data at that moment that matters. So it's about taking that data and saying, okay, what this tells me, for instance, is Lebanese Americans have this particular health characteristic. I don't have any in mind, but I'm just giving you an example. Or it can tell you, to the point Terri Ann and Maya were just talking around redistricting, it can let you know where concentrations of various populace live, and you can then use that for language access purposes. Or specific cultural references if you're trying to do outreach, for instance, around COVID vaccine uptakes or anything similar to that, as we're looking at continued need for vaccine rollouts. So I would say that. Now, when you say, what does it, like when you're talking about the intersectionality of it all, the context of what else are they picking? I think that's a very valid point, because we all recognize that there are very different lived experiences. For instance, if someone was picking white and Lebanese versus someone picking Black and Egyptian, they are going to be having very different lived experiences, and having that additional context that we would want to receive with these changes would allow for even further tailoring and understanding of the context of people's lives, which is why it's really important to be able to have that ability to say, for instance, Black and Egyptian, and identify the lived experience of an Afro-Arab.
Thank you so much, Meeta. Take our next question from Tara. Thanks for hosting this. Can you talk about the difference between race and ethnicity in the MENA context, and how you're thinking to avoid the problem the government has faced with Hispanic being considered an ethnicity as opposed to a race? And then Tara offers, how do you deal with the fact that a significant number of people write in Arab while many others write in specific Arab nationalities? So Tara, I'm going to take the second one, and then Gigi, I'm going to ask you to answer the first one. That is such an important point, and it goes to the importance of disaggregate data. As someone who has checked Arab all the time, and that's not the right thing to do, because it is actually really important that we identify the ethnicity or our national origin, and then we are able to go in on the back end, so to speak, and then put it all together to get us to the Arab American number. But it is incredibly important, and that is going to be part of our education efforts for our GOTC campaigns. And one need only look to the net census numbers that were shared, right? We have Lebanese, Egyptian, and then Arab. And we know we need that information in more of a disaggregate form. But Gigi, can you speak to the first part of the question?
Yeah, I mean, Tara, this is an excellent question and a complicated one. So the national content test that the U.S. Census conducted in 2015, tested a streamlined version that is being proposed by the Office of Management and Budget to combine race and ethnicity into one question to avoid the issue with the Hispanic ethnic category, because many of the findings show that the average person does not differentiate between race and ethnicity in terms of how they identify, right? However, there are differences between race and ethnicity. And, even on the census categories, some of those categories are racial, some are pan-ethnic, some are both. So it becomes really confusing. And so what the hope is with adding a MENA box is to actually measure both sort of pan-ethnicity or race and specific ethnic origin. So like Maya said, we want as specific data as we can possibly get. And Meeta mentioned this, issues with disaggregation and the need to disaggregate so we can actually be able to serve communities in the ways that is needed. And so I think the way that this is going to be avoided, hopefully, and I'm crossing my fingers, I'm speaking it into existence, that when it gets adopted by the Office of Management and Budget, that we'll be able to collect both sort of this pan-ethnic data and also specific nationality data for the MENA group, broadly speaking, as inclusive as we can define it. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Gigi. And next, we can take a question from Sama, who's asking about MENA versus the idea of an Arab American category, feeling that it might be too broad and captures non-Arabic speaking individuals, would not get an accurate count of Arabs alone. What are your thoughts on that perspective? I would, this is one where I would turn it over to Helen, but I will answer, channeling Helen. There were certainly efforts dating back to the first campaigns in the 1980s, and that were then refined to arrive at MENA in 1994, actually, before the 1997 standards were issued. And it was specifically because of the idea that the category needed to be more inclusive. You're talking about real estate on a form, even though now we do a lot of things online, but the idea was that a broader, more inclusive category was more viable. And then within that, because people would check off their national origin or ethnicity, we would still be able to get to the Arab American data. So that has been the approach, and it's one that really does emphasize the importance of understanding it as a geographical category representing diverse communities, plural, and an ethnic category that as I said, allows people to identify with any racial category that they want to. A question: how many years did it take to get to this point in the struggle for a MENA category? Was there resistance in the community to the term MENA for advocates in the Black community who may advocate for a separate ethnic group for Black people descended from slavery in the U.S.? What lessons could they learn from MENA activists? Why don't I ask both Meeta and Gigi actually to comment on that in terms of advocacy on these issues?
Maya, aren't you the one that knows how long you've been working on advocating for a MENA category?
Fine. So it predates the foundation of the Arab American Institute, and with the first major campaign being around 1990. It's taken a long time, but I appreciate the question in the context of the importance of data equity and working in intersectional ways. One of the things I'm really proud of the work we're doing right now is working with SOGI advocates to understand how do we get to sexual orientation, gender identity on the ACS. And it is about data equity. It's about arriving at accurate data so we can all better serve our communities. And I think that's the approach that's been taken by advocates across the board. Gigi, would you offer, and thank you for that, Meeta, but Gigi, would you offer anything else in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always going to be difficult if we're talking about a term that everyone is happy with, that encompasses everyone's experience. I mean, that's impossible. That doesn't exist. And so we're trying to get as close as possible. And that's really where MENA came from. It's inclusive. It's as close as possible. Yes, there's arguments about it being a colonial term, and so are so many other terms we use. And yet we need something so that we can move forward and collect the data we need to serve our communities. And so I just want to note that, because it was a struggle in some ways, and we are still working. And I'm really happy that we have this category, and it seems to, be catching on in the way that we need it to.
So I will add a few things after I so glibly passed it back to you, Maya, which is, this is long work, this is deep work, this is coalition work, it's consensus building work, and it's also work grounded in research. So when we sit here and say that groups here are in support of the addition of a MENA category in OMB's revisions, we do know that the Census Bureau did conduct a national content test in 2015, and it strongly supported the addition of a MENA category. The results strongly supported that, which is my way of saying, and it's not meant as a discouragement, it is meant as just the steps that are gone through. The ability to have research to show the results and to show the impact of how people respond is very important. And the ability to continue to discuss with as many partners as possible, whether or not you think they're your natural allies in the process, just to hear people's voices, again, building that coalition and consensus, so that you are able to then build on the advocacy for whatever you want, which is, advocacy in any field, right? It's about explaining your point of view and coming to this road that consensus is hard to reach. So maybe not the best word, but coming to that, as close to consensus as you can get with the evidence and arguments marshaled behind you to help you get there.
That's so incredibly helpful, Meeta. One of the things I remind myself in this work is that the government form does not give me my identity. It is simply data. that a statistical agency will use to gather this information. So we're working really hard to make sure that the category is there as a checkbox so folks can at least see themselves in it. But at the end of the day, it is about data collection, and the identity piece, which is so sacred to all of us, is represented in different ways. Terri Ann, let me ask you to answer this one. How detailed does this MENA data break down? Does it go local or municipal or at the zip code level? If you can address that issue.
Yeah, sure. So there's data at the national and state levels, and then going down to county, what the Census Bureau calls places, which translation, cities and towns, and then down to the census tract level. And as I mentioned earlier, a census tract is sort of equivalent to a neighborhood, maybe in a urban or suburban area or a rural community. Roughly 4,000 people is the average, or 1,600 housing units. So it does not, these particular data set does not go down to what I said was the block level, which is the smallest level of census geography. The Census Bureau also has not tabulated these data for other sorts of, I'll call them political small p geographies, such as legislative districts, congressional districts, school districts, and the like. So that's what we have so far through this data set.
Thank you, Terri Ann. We've got another question follow-up from Tara on the question about Armenians. There are also many other groups who are not listed, but might consider themselves MENA, i.e. Afghans, Uzbekis, Azerbaijan, etc. Will there be a hard geographic line drawn eventually, or will MENA be something that people can self-select, providing an actual MENA option to select, just as if there is, quote, a white box to check? So I would, I can start, and happy to have anyone else come in on that. Meeta mentioned already the 2015 National Content Test. A lot of how the Census Bureau has approached defining MENA comes from that. And the sort of the way we've approached the Bureau in talking with them about this, it's been that it's a geographical category. So you're literally looking at a section of the map, which includes, for example, Turkey, because Turkey is geographically within the Middle East. Now, when they did the national content test, they didn't find that a lot of Turkish Americans necessarily identified with the MENA category. So there's more work to be done there in terms of understanding how to best do that. But I think with regards to Armenians, and it's a really important point to think about here, we're not talking about Armenia as the country, because the Armenia as the country does not, like one would argue, Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan, does not fall within the geographical definition of MENA. But Armenian Americans that are here in the United States do identify as a transnational community from the Middle East and North Africa. So if the objective is to count Americans, which it is, then I think we have to view it in that context and understand it in that context. And while I've already praised our colleagues at the Bureau for releasing this data, one of the issues that we continue to have is that we believe there really is a great need for a MENA subject area expert at the Bureau who can assist with this process anytime that we're engaging in it, but certainly who can be there while we are undergoing the addition of a new category for the first time ever. So there's a lot, that's a great question, and there's a lot that's there, but it does necessitate the need for the Bureau to have more subject area expertise and to conduct more testing so that we can better understand how to approach this. Any other comments from my colleagues?
Which, Tara, if the revised OMB standards do treat MENA equally, as a new category in a combined question, which I described earlier, then a respondent could simply check MENA. Doesn't have to write in anything, don't have to select something else if that's the only way they want to identify, and that would be it. I think that's what you asked. And
I do want to acknowledge that the census has codes attached to nationalities, right? So that's where the recoding comes in with some other race. So for example, if you put Egyptian under some other race, they're going to recode you as white, right? And this is a big deal because it's the first time the census added codes for MENA, right? So these data. And so I'm so happy that we have this. And I do want to say that some of these other groups are already categorized under, for example, Asian, and already are represented somewhere on the census, where MENA isn't represented anywhere until now, with at least some codes, right? And one of the things that we talked about on the NAC, the National Advisory Committee, is that we absolutely need further testing, and we also need the category to be adopted, and then we will test once the category is adopted, right? Because we want to do things in a way where we aren't stopping kind of the addition of a category, because people are saying, oh, we need more research, because we've been down that road, we've dealt with that. We don't want that. So there's some of it, it takes also the patience of kind of this stepwise approach to getting accurate MENA data. Sometimes just takes, like, we get a little bit and then we get more, and then we're able to, for example, have a denominator of this community on a national level so that we can actually say there's an undercount or not. So we are really at the beginning steps in a lot of ways of gathering accurate data. And so I just, I try to stay patient and have faith that it's going to go through the process. But, a lot of these things are so slow, but there is, usually a process and a method to the madness to make sure that, we can sort of move these issues along.
Thank you for that, Gigi. And thank you for mentioning the codes, because I think that it's actually tied to Tara's question as well. Though the Bureau has, prior to this release, based on the ACS data, had estimated Arab Americans to roughly be 2.1 million, the Institute's estimate is closer to 3.7. And we also believe that's actually a conservative estimate. But the way we arrive at that data is to use those codes. And when we pull that information, so even if the Bureau thinks it's difficult to understand, and again, I'm not saying this critically, but even if the existing race and ethnicity standards make it difficult for them to understand that someone who is Sudanese can both be from MENA and can be Arab American and can be Black, and all of those things come together to still, be a person and how they self-identify. We use that. Those codes are how we would pull that data. So it's possible that Somali Americans obviously would identify one way and another way, and we would have both. So that's the point of approaching this in a way that says it's about self-identification, and those of us who do the data crunching will pull those codes to allow the full representation of the community as it exists. And I say that we would do that when the way we define MENA and the way we would define Arab Americans as well. We are almost at time. No, we're at time. I'm sorry, we're at time. But I'm going to ask each of you to just close us off real quick with what's one thing that we can do between now and the end of the year, or looking forward in terms of advocacy for a MENA category.
I'll go first. I will re-up that we do have a data disaggregation newsletter. The chat is disabled for the audience, so I will give it to you all to include in the follow-up email, but I would encourage people to sign up for that newsletter, which will give more specific actions that people can take.
Thank you, Meeta. Gigi?
I just want to say this is the first step. We all have a responsibility to advocate for a MENA box in all of our different contexts. That doesn't stop. That has always been around. And you can use this data release as evidence for needing to collect MENA data at whatever institution, organization that you're at. So this is actually giving you some evidence to provide as you're advocating for this.
Thank you, Gigi. Terri Ann?
Well, just quickly, I would say I think it's time to really start educating your communities about why it's so important to collect, to report, and for Bureau to collect and to produce these data, and to start reassuring them about the confidentiality of what the Census Bureau and other federal agencies do, because many people, I suspect, in your communities are understandably cautious if not afraid of providing their national origin identity. So it's going to take some work in that regard to get the best data possible once the opportunity becomes available.
Thank you, Terri Ann, Gigi, Meeta, and all of you for joining us today. You self-selected into this Nerd Fest, and we're so grateful that you did. So thank you for doing that. Honestly, you did take a first step today by learning more about this issue. I encourage you to look up YallaCountMeIn.org. It is the 2030 Decennial Census Campaign in support of this category and data equity, specifically for Arab Americans. Please remain in touch with us. We'll let you know about the next item coming up in this series and continue to push forward. Thanks all. Have a great day.